Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast, hosted by the Rutgers Law Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. This is Dr. Isa Mohammed Septi Samara, licensed master social worker and faculty affiliate at CSRR. Today I have the pleasure of guest hosting this episode of the Race and Rights Podcast in place of my colleague, Professor Sahar Aziz. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities here as well as abroad. If you find the podcast informative, consider supporting it by making a donation at csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. You can also follow CSRR on social media at Rutgers CSRR on Instagram and LinkedIn and at RUCSRR on X and Facebook. In our last episode, we begin a powerful conversation with four brilliant social work scholars, Dr. Siham Al-Qasim, Dr. Nuha Doy-Ketchad, Dr. Bryn King, and doctoral candidate Amala Baksh. During that conversation, we unpacked the systemic nature of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racism and examined how these interlocking forms of oppression show up across policies, institutions, and professional spaces within social work itself. We also discussed how the social work profession's longstanding silence and selective empathy have too often reinforced harm rather than challenged it. In the second part of our discussion, we turn our attention to how the profession responds, and sometimes fails to respond, to dissenting views and calls for neutrality. We'll explore what these debates mean for social workers on the ground, particularly in their work with youth and communities most affected by racism and surveillance. And finally, we'll close with a collective call to action, asking what it means to move beyond symbolic gestures and stand in genuine solidarity with Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and all communities fighting for justice and liberation. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right back in. I want to pick up right where we left off. We were talking about this concept of Weepy Universalism that you all coined in your forthcoming work within the social work context. And the term describes the tendency within social work and allied professions to invoke empathy and neutrality in ways that actually mask power and sustain equality. And we talked about that for a bit. I want to unpack it here a little bit more, right? There's this argument that, this Weepy Universalist argument as we've been talking about, but there's another one. So all of us here are social workers. Some of us are clinicians, and all of us are researchers in some capacity. And specifically in the academic spaces, when we talk about performative solidarity, it often takes a different, it's characterized in a different way of kind of open debate. And so I'll give you an example here. I'm thinking specifically of a recent paper that was published back in March of 2025 in the Journal of Teaching and Social Work by a well-known social work researcher named Dr. Bruce Thayer, which, full transparency, he's a former professor of mine over at Florida State University. Him and I have a pretty good relationship. But he published a paper called Mandated Ideologies Are Harmful to Social Work Practices. And in this paper, he argues that groups like NASW or the Society for Social Work and Research really are overstepping their roles when they take public positions on political issues, right? Like Palestine. And again, I can feel myself recoiling by even framing this as a political issue, but that's the argument that they're making, right? And it suggests that such actions done by these organizations to make a public statement undermine the association's credibility and potentially harm individual members' careers by imposing what he calls ideological mandates. And the idea here is that the role of these professional organizations are really to represent diverse views and protect academic integrity, quote unquote. But again, it really comes up when we talk about naming the genocide in Gaza. I can't remember a robust debate about this before that time, although there may have been. I want to pull out an excerpt from Dr. Thayer's work that I think encapsulates this argument. And I'm going to quote from that paper, Mandated Ideologies Are Harmful to Social Work Practice. In it, Dr. Thayer argues, quote, sometimes our professional association take positions on issues supposedly reflective of the views of the entire membership. For example, the NASW endorses presidential candidates. As another example, the Society for Social Work and Research publishes editorials saying, quote unquote, as social workers, we must speak up about Palestine. Must we? Really? Why not speak up for persons with intellectual disabilities or discrimination against transgender individuals? What elevates the terrible experiences of the people of Palestine above all other issues, apart from an author using his or her personal publishing platform to express their views and try to elevate them to ideological mandates? Perhaps we should consider Demir's position that scholarly associations aren't entitled to their opinions. And then that's the end of the excerpt there. To give a little context on Demir's view, his view suggests that
position statements, right, from professional organizations is a problem for several reasons. For one, he would argue that there's a chilling effect on debate and the potential silencing of dissenting members that occurs when a professional association declares there's only one right way of thinking about an issue. And we run the risk, again, him arguing, of eroding the organization's legitimacy and effectiveness by turning it into one more political player or advocacy group. And so I'll stop there. I think that more or less describes what I'm talking about, not the Weepy universalist position, but the academic integrity, we want to keep things open for debate. And that's the reason why our social work professional organizations have been quote unquote silent. It's not because they are silent, but they just want to leave room for debate. So I'm looking for reactions here. Bryn, I see you kind of leaning into the camera. What do you got for me?
Well, I mean, okay, so like first things first, I mean, we talked about silence, right? And we talked about all of the ways that silence operates. And so first and foremost, if there was opportunity for debate, there would be no expectation around silence, right? So those two things are sort of fundamentally contradictory, right? So like, do we have debate or do we not talk about it? Because those are not the same thing, right? That's just a fundamental contradiction. The problem is that this is sort of very typical ways of like neoliberalism, white supremacy. This is just the way the colonial apparatus operates. You are not legitimate unless you're perceived as objective. And the only people who have the opportunity to be objective are those for whom the system operates successfully. And that is for the dominant group, right? And so it's quite comfortable, right? Like it's quite comfortable for me to not have an opinion about it because everything that is happening works for me. This also overlays kind of the struggle of legitimacy that is the yoke on social works. Like it's the luggage we drag ever since the Flexner report. Our question of legitimacy, right, as a profession has always been in question. Our legitimacy as researchers, and the only way that we can be legitimate is to be as white and as neutral and as objective and as systematically rigorous as possible. And that is the only form of legitimacy in the context of social work. You're not allowed to have a stake in it, to have, as we called it in the other paper, like skin in the game. That makes you both a target and too subjective to do any legitimate research. So like neutrality works when the system works for you. And yet we are expected to engage in advocacy, right? We are expected to do research that uncovers the vulnerability and the populations that have been harmed systemically or experiencing sort of acute vulnerability, even in the context of, why aren't we talking about people with intellectual disabilities? If I stood on a street corner and said, we need to care about people with intellectual disabilities, people would be like, great, go about your business. It's fine. I would not be accused of being unsafe, unfit to teach to teach students or to exist in my institution. There is no sort of like, these are not, and this is what I was talking about earlier, kind of have too much to say, it's hard for me to organize, but these are not interchangeable, right? Like the part of the systemic harm that is experienced by Palestinians in Gaza is the world's unwillingness to respond to their harm, right? To see it and not care, to be indifferent to it. I mean, really, ultimately, neutrality for me is indifference, right? At best. At worst, it's a commitment to taking a side that isn't Palestinians or people who are being harmed. It is taking the side that says, this is right and we're going to sustain this. There was one last thing that I wanted to say about it, and then I just got myself distracted.
That's totally fine. If I could jump in here really quickly, I appreciate you bringing this back to the Flexner report. And for those of you listening that don't get the reference, shame on you. You should be paying attention to your social work history course. I'm just joking. I've noticed that they've pulled it out of a lot of curriculum. Anyway, I forget the year. Correct. Jump in if you remember all the details. But a person by the name of Fletcher, I think from the medical background, was charged with doing a review of social work as a profession and concluded that social work was not, in fact, a profession because they didn't have their own knowledge base. And this really, if you look at the history of social work, gave rise to the empiricist positivist movement within social work specifically. And so I hear you talking about, this positivist mentality, this empiricist mentality of like, no, I don't want to, I want to be as objective as possible, and how that objectivity is really gatekeeping, right? I think I wouldn't be surprised if the group of us here are accused of not being objective and being too subjective because of our own identities and things like this. And in some circles, we've tried to deconstruct that with the with the addition of lived experiences and all of those things. But Siham, I see you kind of at the edge of your seat, wanted to jump in here, so I'll give it to you.
Yeah, okay. I just have to say this, and I'm so happy that you brought up some insights around some theoretical analyses and the importance of understanding how sort of positivist ideologies, which are, for me, very colonial in a lot of ways, are entrenched in social work history. But also, I just want to say that reading this particular article is a fairly unsophisticated analysis and argument for several reasons. And there are a lot of anti-colonial, post-colonial scholars, critical race theorists that I think would probably be able to sort of tease out a lot of the different forms of, racism and white supremacy that is underwritten within this, and coloniality that is, I believe, it potentially informs some of the stuff that came out in this specific article. And just a few things I'd like to say is, the weapon, I think, Bryn, you did it, beautifully and pointed out the weaponization of academic neutrality, right? The false equivalence and deflection within the article, comparing, Palestinian liberation with intellectual disabilities or discrimination against transgender individuals, which is also really important for us to focus on and talk about, is not solidarity. I think it's a diversionary tactic within discourse. Again, this article beautifully lays out a lot of different tactics that are used in policing speech and policing academic work and white supremacy discourse. There are so many theorists that talk about this. One thing I'll point out, the argument in this particular article that social work or academic associations should not take positions on issues like Palestine reproduces, I think, ongoing colonial division between knowledge and politics. Again, something that Bryn pointed out quite beautifully, which is a hallmark of the coloniality of power. Manolo, Maldonado Torres, a lot of other, theorists talk about the way that Eurocentric epistemic order often defines what is objective, what is academic, what is rational, and it positions anti-colonial struggles or anti-racist struggles as outside of the domain of legitimate scholarly inquiry, right? Like, I just think it does a great job at illustrating this type of discourse. I think something that we should continue to talk about and discuss, and it's not at all surprising.
One more thing to add, the last point that I was thinking about around this excerpt in this paper is something that we also talked about in terms of the way that the silence operates and manifests in this performative solidarity is the both sidism piece, right? And in here, the very logic that Palestinian lives are ungrievable or are only valued in the context of being equally held in other. So in order for us to even speak about Palestinian suffering or what has happened, it's not even Palestinian suffering. It's like the outrageous violations of human rights and bodily integrity. The only way to do that is if we hold somebody else's pain at the same time, because alone Palestinians are not worth grieving. Right. And this is the sort of the dehumanization, which is systemic, structural. We just accept this as fact. Right. We're not allowed to talk about Palestinians because then we would have to talk about everybody's suffering, right? Because alone, they're not grievable. They're not worth it. They are not worthy of that kind of attention. And that's what really, one of the things that really struck me. And this is what we see around how particularly our field navigates the question of Palestine is the only way to do it is to invoke debate where then you have the other side represented. And then in that, Palestinian lives are potentially grievable, although they're sort of held with equal weight with sort of the Israeli position, or more broadly, depending on how people frame it, the Jewish position, which is, the conflation of the two is a huge problem, which we haven't necessarily talked about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I appreciate you bringing that up, this both sidism, as you call it, because you're absolutely right. And I mean, right here in the excerpt that I just read, named persons with intellectual disabilities, transgender individuals, and CM, as you point out, all important issues, right? We're not arguing that these are not important issues. But to be quite honest, I'm a little resentful when it's you have to hold both at one time in order to have the conversation about Palestinians. And that is also a method to reinforce the dehumanization of the Palestinian community. I don't quite know where I'm going with this, except to say that I think they are complementary arguments, this Weepy universalist argument and this like empiricist, we need to remain academically sound argument really enforce what we all know and feel and describe in some way of this enforced silence, this silence that is just deafening and impacts you on an everyday basis. And not to mention the emotional burden that has, right? Work just becomes more difficult. Living becomes more difficult, becomes, I think, Bryn, you said this earlier, impossible to exist in that space. And I want to bring this home to the impact on clients and on youth. And I'm biased here. My focus is on children and child welfare. But as social workers talk about mandated ideologies, I mean, we have the responsibility to safeguard the dignity, safety, and well-being of our clients, right? It's in our code of ethics, right? The dignity and worth of every single individual to affirm their identities, to address systemic inequities that shape their lived experiences. All of this isn't controversial, shouldn't be controversial stuff, right? This is the bread and butter upon which the social work profession really thrives on. And I forget if it was Amla or you, Bryn, that brought up, this is why students come to the profession. This is why I came to the profession. I really resonated and I believed wholeheartedly in our code of ethics. And so for those of you who have been doing clinical work, and Siham, I'll open this up to you first, because I know you've done clinical work in this area and you've also done some research in this area. What has been the impact of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racism on our young people, from the folks that you talk to?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. So in my recent national study with 28 Muslim youth across Canada, I collected the data February 2024, so 4 months after the start of the genocide in Gaza began. We asked, young people across several provinces who were experiencing overlapping realities of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian racism about their experiences, right? And their stories reveal, I think, a deep crisis in belonging and safety, but also extraordinary strength, endurance, in the face of watching the violence unfold, and then also, having to deal with the repercussions and the violence, against them, often because of their Palestine activism. So there's several themes, and you've described a climate where, all of these forms of discrimination and racism, particularly anti-Palestinian racism, became a very sort of intensifying but invisible reality. So, they were experiencing more frequently forms of anti-Palestinian racism. And by the way, only 5 out of the 20 were actually Palestinian. And they really clocked this as anti-Palestinian racism, especially in schools, universities, where it's denied, it's dismissed. They spoke about being targeted for wearing the kufiya, for naming Gaza, for saying Palestine, for simply being Palestinian or even visibly Muslim. Many said that this was sort of this denial of anti-Palestinian racism compounded the harm that they felt, and told them basically, directly or indirectly, that their pain was sort of unspeakable, that their safety isn't part of the institution's concern, or, and many of them came post-secondary, secondary education. Again, a lot of them experienced anti-Palestinian racism at the intersection of other forms of racism. They talked about like anti-Palestinian racism not operating alone. And oftentimes they couldn't decode which type of racism they were experiencing at the time. I think one of the youth said it was sort of a mix that you often can't untangle. So for visibly Muslim or Arab youth, especially hijab identifying folks, the intersection magnified their exposure to harassment and surveillance, public hostility, social aggression. Visibility itself became very dangerous for them. Youth described feeling watched, whispered about, or, directly threatened oftentimes. And this constant sort of vigilance for them created this chronic stress and exhaustion. Some psychologists, I've heard the term racial battle fatigue. And I want to say that this is sort of was the message that the youth shared. It was this fatigue of again, watching the genocide unfold, watching the devastation, wanting to do something. But so for them, it was like racial battle fatigue was just surviving school for them every day and wanting to talk about Gaza and Palestine. There was a sort of pattern of neglect and erasure that they talked about, despite the visibility of the hate crimes. that they witnessed, their friends experienced, or family members experienced, this anti-Palestinian racism, remained largely absent from institutional discourse. They saw how, AMR, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and oppression were addressed in statements and training, but APR very rarely even named. Digital spaces as sites of racial violence. They talked about that a lot, what it felt like watching that and seeing, aside from, friends, people they know being doxxed or harassed, flooded with hate speech, in their DMs after posting about Gaza. For many of them, the internet were the both place where they needed to stay up to date and watch what was happening, but also then having to experience the racial violence, right? I think one youth talked about, seeing a lot of hatred and discourse when watching videos where children and women and men and boys were being murdered, and people saying, they deserve it, and how that really did a toll essentially on their mental health. And then the institutional silencing and Palestine exception, which we've talked about. They talked about a ton. Principal being told by a principal, you can't talk about this. It's too controversial. Folks being suspended for posting on social media about Palestine and Gaza, banning of the wearing of a kufiya. I have youth in my family, in my extended community, wanting to wear a kufiya during graduation, being told they couldn't do that. So, there are so many things that have happened to Muslim youth, and that's just a snapshot, and that was 28 youth. And I think this illustrates the importance of continuing to think about or research and gather the data, because as practitioners, when we work with folks who are, suffering a number, having a difficult time with their mental health and their wellness, understanding how sort of these things impact their day-to-day is important. As a clinician, it is very important for you to understand how racism, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Palestinian racism, intensify a person's current difficulties. And the social, emotional, and psychological consequences. A lot of these talked about feeling depressed, anxious about going out. But then many of them talked about the places and spaces that were really integrating and supportive, and how important those collectives were, being in places at a mosque or community center, or similar to our experience together, being in space and being in community and talking about how we're doing, and having those moments as being really, really important to supporting their mental health.
Right. I'm thinking how important that this work is for those clinicians out there who are working in areas. I think of the region I'm in, very rural state here in Arkansas. It's really tough to find a clinician for a young person who shares that identity if they are Arab, Palestinian, Muslim. Are very few of us out here. I'm a licensed master social worker here in the state, but I myself don't do clinical work right now. And so there have been a lot of folks coming from the community asking, hey, Issa, where do I go? What do I do? And it's really challenging because I don't know whether I know many folks in the community. Obviously, I'm a social worker here, but I don't know whether they have the knowledge or the knowledge base in order to actually hold space for a child who walks in who is just is suffering from racial battle fatigue, as you called it. And just the compounded harm over and over and over again, how silencing it is as a child to see something that is so obvious to you on a daily basis, and that it's just denied from authority figures. We talked about authority figures in our profession, right? Those who get to call the shots and say that, this is what objectivity means. But when we bring it down to the level of the youth, any adult becomes an authority figure really quickly. It's when your authority figures are telling you, no, you can't talk about this, just the impact there. Brittany, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I just wanted to say, so much of what I do as somebody who teaches practice is around the way that you signal your readiness, especially with young people. I teach a class on social work practice with children and adolescents, and the way that, the folks that we work with in community for clinical work, they're watching us, and they know the moment that we become uncomfortable. They know the moment that we get stuck because we don't have language or preparation for being able to do this. And if you haven't developed a position, if you have not done the work to develop a position on how you feel and to articulate how you feel around what has happened in Palestine and what continues to happen even in this moment, that young person, you might be the first person and the only person that they will seek out. You might be a social worker in a school. You might be the child welfare worker. You might be working in a settlement agency or public mental health kind of situation. And the moment they are assessing whether or not, because we all know we have to assess, are you safe to discuss this with? And the moment that you are unable to articulate a position, the moment that you seize up, right? Like anytime I open my mouth in a space where I could be talking about, Palestine and what's happening, I can feel the room seize up. Like one of my favorite moments is were several years ago. It's maybe like 7 years ago. Maybe you were there, maybe not. Angela Davis was like the plenary speaker. And at some point, as Angela Davis will, she raised Palestine. And I literally felt the entire room seize up. There was no vocal reaction, but the entire room, and I usually describe it.
And this was 7 years ago.
Yes. We can't talk about
for context.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and maybe longer, I can't even remember exactly when. And that continues to be what happens. The moment that it's raised, people's, shoulders come up, they become defensive, they become activated. How are we going to respond, not just to Palestinian youth, but Muslim youth, Arab youth, young people who are unhappy about what's happening? They're watching us. They're watching us. Do you know how to navigate this? Do you have capacity to just be in a conversation with me, to hear me when I start? These are the fundamentals of social work practice. This is not subjective or unique. We are trained and should be trained. We have an ethical responsibility to provide quality services. That means that we have to have capacity to talk about what young people want to talk about, or families, or, older adults, whoever it is. The fact that we, even within our schools of social work, don't have the capacity beyond the people sitting in this room and a handful of others to engage in these dialogues and to bring people's tolerance and capacity to be in conversation, means that as a field, we are not going to be able to respond to this moment and to the needs of our communities that we're going to be serving moving forward. Sorry, that was my soapbox.
No, I love the soapbox, and I'm glad that you called out that this isn't just, so one, this is social work basics. This is 101, right? This is what we're teaching our social workers in their base level clinical courses. This should be obvious, and yet it's not. And also to call out, this is not just an issue that is going to be with your Palestinian clients or your Arab clients or even just your Muslim clients, right? And so if you think you can hide behind demographics here and be like, oh, I don't think I'm going to have any of those clients walk through the door, you're wrong. I mean, Siham, you pointed out 5 of the 28 youth that you spoke to in your study were Palestinian and the rest were not. I believe they were all identified as Muslim, right? But even still, they understood it as anti-Palestinian racism. They clocked it, I think was the word that you used. That same phenomenon exists whether you are white, black, transgender, any of your identity is Jewish. It doesn't matter. If you are a youth and you have your ear to the ground, so to speak, and you are aware of what's going on in Palestine and you care deeply about it, then this is going to impact you. And you're absolutely right, Bryn. The idea of tense, I've been in countless rooms where people tense up, right? Especially in professional spaces, especially in clinical spaces where people just don't want to touch it. And as clinicians, you're supposed to name the taboo, quote unquote, right? Those are the basics. And in those spaces of discomfort is where a lot of really good work happens. I want to end our conversation on something that, Bryn, I think you brought up into the room earlier. And it's this concept of sumud, right? Which is an Arabic word drawing on indigenous Palestinian epistemologies. And you all talk about this beautifully in your piece, and talking about istidhad and this idea of collective rising up and sumud, steadfastness, to name the genocide, to reject neutral language, resist settler colonialism, and prompt, importantly, institutional accountability, both at the state, national, and professional levels. And I want to point out that we're not alone. We're a small group, but we're not alone. A small group's beginning to take root. Groups like Social Workers for Palestine, Palestinian Union of Social Workers, and psychologists have started to demand that our profession extend its values of human rights and determinations to Palestinians and to walk away from this Palestinian or Palestine exception. I want to, for my Arabic speakers in the room, and specifically my Palestinian colleagues in the room, I want us to just reflect very briefly on this concept of sumud and full transparency. And I haven't told anyone this, not even my own parents. This will come out after a baby is born. But I intend to name my daughter, who will be born here very soon. We're recording here in October. She'll be born in the first week of November, bi'idhni ta'ala. I plan to name her Slamida from Samud, right? And so it's a concept that's very near and dear to the Palestinian heart and condition. Nuha, I see you kind of reacting to that. I wonder if you have anything to say about the concept of Samud.
Oh my, I have so much to say about that concept. First of all, the name or the word Sumud comes from the verb samada. And it's, if you want to name your daughter Sumud, there's many girls. We name, like it's in Palestine, there's many girls, their name is Sumud. So it's the same, that concept. For us as Palestinians, we know Sumud and understand Sumud with the milk that we have from our mothers, like I don't know how to say it, but you know what I mean. Like we open our eyes on Sumud, and it's for us. Sumud is just to do whatever it takes to stay true to what we believe in, and which is our right for self-determination, our right for, to enjoy like basic human rights like any other human, to do whatever it takes to refuse oppression and to fight oppression, to the extent that like people will lose their lives. Like that's the extreme, like I see that the extreme part of it, when a human loses their lives in order to maintain what they believe in and their right to live as any other humans in this world. So that's about Sumud, and it's been used a lot actually in the past to describe like the different forms as a form of resistance against, of course, occupation and oppression and settler colonialism and decades of military ruling us with fire and, violence shaping every aspect of our lives. So that's what I say, like Sumud is the air that we breathe as Palestinians. Just without that, you see it. So see it, like I see it in my, like coming from my grandmother to me, to my mother to me, passing it to my children, in terms of maintaining even the feeling to have that part of me wants always to say and scream, I'm Palestinian. And just like when I came here, I was surprised, like I wanted to meet any Palestinian scholars and just like, but unfortunately, the thing is, what I start to understand that people are worried from consequences, even to say I'm Palestinian. So when Amila told me about Siham and how she's also active, I don't to say there isn't many Palestinian scholars, of course there's many, but like to find someone in the close circle around me within like Southern Ontario who speaks the same language, who's Palestinian, who's not afraid to say I'm Palestinian, is just part of what Sumud mean for me, not allowing the reality around us to crush our souls. As I said, it crushes the soul, but not allowing it, standing up again and refusing that our souls be crushed by what we witness and what we see, and insisting on fighting back, fighting the oppression, fighting the injustice, insisting on raising our voices, because I want to speak my truth. I don't want others to speak my truth as they perceive it or as they understand it, covering it with whatever they want to say, neutrality or whatever. Actually, I don't see them as neutral. I see them on the contrary. They are complicit. They are taking whoever claims that they are neutral, they are fighting the people who are holding. I don't like to use the human rights discourse a lot. I know it but like holding to what makes humans humans, let's say. Let's put it that way. So people who claim neutrality, I think that they are complicit, and I believe strongly that they are complicit. And this neutrality is violence, and it aims to crush people who want to continue fighting for justice. Yeah, I'll put it like that. Right. I'm afraid to say fighting. Again, we don't. Right. I don't want to use the word fighting. I want to use the word, challenge. Always I've been during my years since I started my PhD in 2012 until now, I've been always hearing these words. I have to massage my words. I cannot translate what I want, from Arabic, what I feel, because it might sound to people as aggressive or violent. Again, people are worried about this, but the violence that's enacted in our bodies and our souls, it doesn't count. But we will worry about the feelings of a group of people who or their safety. But well, just jumping from one place to the other. So we are worried about their safety, but we are not, like, the bodies, the limbs, the children that are being killed doesn't move us. Then this is not neutrality. I think this is not new. It's taking stand with the oppressor, with the killer, with a nuclear state against that fight a besieged population. So yeah, having the capacity to continue and to be able to continue, maybe taking a break and then, but maintain the ability to keep going, even when we are tired. That's what sumud means. And sumud, I see it as the first step for istinhad. Start with sumud, and sumud that leads to istinhad. So they both, I think they both, we are here still conceptualizing this, but I believe it feeds each other. We start with the sumud that leads to istinhad. And istinhad, it came from, again, in our late article, looking for, again, brilliant ideas in terms of she wants a word to call for action. And we're looking for a word. And then we wanted to use we couldn't find a word in English that describe what istinhad mean in one term, like one word. So to translate istinhad from Arabic, from the word nahada, which is like nahada is to rise. So istinhad, it means like it's like a collective awakening and rising, like in face of injustice. And so it's a collective awakening, rising to fight against injustice and for human dignity. That's what we mean by istinhad. So sumud is the first step, and then we translate sumud into action through istinhad, through collective awakening, through people coming together to fight injustice. And for me, I will say there's no room here for neutrality. Neutrality is violence.
Well said. I also I really appreciate how, and Siham as well, in your piece that you actually, it was really fun for me to see the Arabic script actually printed. That was really important for me as a Palestinian, as an Arab person, because you're right. I mean, the Arabic language is bahri, like to say that it's like an ocean, has this ocean of meaning, bahr meaning the sea. Like the words they encapsulate. So I think it's quite appropriate for us to say that our call to action is sumud, leading to istinhad. But Siham, I want you to jump in because I know that this also resonates with you.
It really does. And even just for like the first time I heard the term sumud being discussed, online and people using the term, I was just amazed as a Palestinian in person. And my father always, used this term with us. It's just it's part of the language that we use when we think about what it means to be Palestinian and our connection to the land and our indigeneity. And I think quite often about the need to incorporate our own epistemologies and ontological understandings of things within our academic work. And I very firmly, many years ago, decided I'm going to do that. And I'm going to publish articles that really center certain understandings. And so, sumud or istinhad specifically, I think other people could probably think about it as a Palestinian echo of global liberation ethics. And we write about this in our article. You can think of it like this, similar to other movements or ethics, in South Africa, within Indigenous scholarship, Black and queer abolitionist movements. And they all share the same sort of principle, and that sort of refusal is a form of creation and transformation, and a call to consciousness, a spiritual and political and moral awakening. And we talk a little bit about, so what does this mean for social workers, especially those, outside of Palestine, for folks who are really wanting to engage in this work? And we've got sort of a list of things that we've provided for folks, and I'll touch on them a little bit here. Might be a great way to end things. I think so. That is, first, to understand your power. And social work is not neutral. And we've said this. Neutrality in the face of genocide or apartheid is complicity. Use your positions, your classrooms, your policy spaces, your research, your clinical interventions to name what's happening. And in the article, we put in caps, say the words genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. Stating a thing is really important, and that is the very least something that you can do. Don't hide behind terms like conflict or complexity. Stop obscuring the truth. Reject sanitized or balanced language that erases power and centers comfort over justice. Our ethics demand clarity, not caution. Third, disrupt hypocrisy. Call out professional associations, scholars who write articles, schools, organizations that issue anti-oppressive statements but stay silent on Palestine, or worse, penalize people who speak up. Silence is not safety, it's participation in harm. And finally, we invite you to embody Samud and Istinhal, but that means centering Palestinian voices, experiences, and analyses, not as case studies or sympathy stories. We are teachers. We are folks who also resist. We survive. So stand in solidarity without demanding that those under siege make their pain palatable to the dominant gaze. That's also very, very important. And we know Gaza is not a metaphor. Genocide is not a theoretical concept. These are real material violences. And our profession must respond with courage and not neutrality.
I couldn't say it any better. Thank you, Siham, Nuha, Amala, Bryn, for sharing your time, your insights, your scholarship. And thank you to everyone who has listened to this conversation. Like I said at the beginning, this is a hard conversation, but we can do hard things. And it's my hope that this is just the beginning. In addition to this podcast, our intention is to create tools that can better help folks understand and interface with this important issue. And in these materials, we'll explore what it means for social workers to navigate professional spaces where they can't always be fully authentic for the reasons that we just described, and how that really creates moral injury, not only perpetuating harm against Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, but also wounding other marginalized colleagues. And we'll expand on the consequences of this concept of Weepy Universalism, the absence of solidarity for Palestinians. So please stay tuned for more opportunities in the future to unpack these difficult but necessary conversations about race, justice, and the profession that all of us care really deeply about. Until then, I'm Ais Mohammed Septi Samara, and thank you for listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.